This is great. So I'm seeing the pace now of new attendees or new people coming in starting to slow. So I think that means that we are at the top of the hour and it's time to kick off this session. So once again, thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about patient influencers on social media. And I'll begin by introducing the panel that I have. So we'll have a screen up shortly that will show a quick bio of the panelists who are joining me today. And we're going to be talking about the breadth and depth of patient influence online, how to really speak the language of patient advocates, patient educators, and build meaningful partnerships across our organizations. I'm Marjorie Stiegler. I'm Senior Medical Lead with U.S. Medical Affairs at GlaxoSmithKline, and I'll be moderating this panel. We are going to be talking today about a few key things. The first is, what are we talking about when we talk about patient advocates or patient influencers? What we mean and what we don't mean by that. We're also going to be talking about why you, the viewer, should care. So whether you are a patient or whether you represent an advocacy organization or whether you work in pharma, you have a stake in this. And so we'll discuss it from a variety of views. And then third, we'll talk about how to do this well. What does an effective, good engagement strategy look like? What are some of the potential risks and some of the mitigations that we know work well? So this is going to be a really great panel. Let me begin by asking our panelists to introduce themselves. I'll go as we're listed across the screen there. So I am going to start with Lilly. If you'd give us a quick sentence or two about you, your experience, and your perspective on this topic.
Thanks so much, Marjorie. I'm thrilled to be here today. And my name is Lilly Stairs. I am first and foremost a patient advocate living with 3 autoimmune diseases. It's how I got into the healthcare space. I've been working in healthcare with pharma, biotech, and health tech for the past decade, and currently serve as the founder and principal at Patient Authentic, where I work to help companies build programs that empower and educate patients. And much of my work is centered around working with patient influencers. So today I'm helping to bridge the gap between coming from the advocacy world myself as a patient advocate, and then working on the consulting side and how we can all work together to make an impact.
Thanks, Lilly. Great to have you here. Dariel?
Hi, everybody. I'm Darielle Ruderman, and I am at GlaxoSmithKline, where I am a consumer marketing lead. I've been in consumer marketing for my entire career in pharma for more than 20 years. And really, as most brands just sort of got into the social part over the last few years. And just very excited to talk with you guys today and share a little bit about my experience. I do need to caveat that my views are my own and I'm not speaking on behalf of GSK.
Thank you so much. Yes, nor am I, although I'm just moderating. And Jack, could I have you introduce yourself, please?
Absolutely. I'm Jack Barrette, Chief Innovation Officer at Health Union. That's new as of June of this year. WeGo Health was my previous company. I founded that 14 years ago. WeGo Health remains the world's largest network of patient influencers. We empower those folks. We have over 100,000 members in virtually every condition who are patient influencers, advocates, and collaborators. They are now part of the Health Union world, who has built over the years 34 and growing deep patient communities. So in every way, we have been helping pharmaceutical companies to connect with influencers and patient communities and really make those happen in pharma safe ways. So I'm excited to be here.
Thanks, Jack. That's great. And Christina, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be part of this discussion, and I really look forward to discussing over this hour how we can engage with patient leaders in social media. My name is Christina Kotsi, and I work in patient engagement in the Oncology Global Medical Affairs at Novartis. We see that social media have become, I would say, the primary channel where conversations are happening between patients. So it's really important to understand how we can engage compliantly with patient leaders, as well as leverage the insights that we can collect through these engagements. And I would also like to acknowledge that I represent my own thoughts and not Novartis in this session. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much. So now let me just remind folks who have joined that you can use the Q&A or the chat, although then you will see me looking at multiple streams of questions at a time. So forgive me if I'm looking here or there, That's because I'm checking on incoming questions to be sure that we tackle everything that you want to know about. So please use that Q&A. Let us know what's on your mind. And to kick us off, I think we should tackle the definition and scope of what we're talking about. So when we talk about patient-to-patient influence, Jack, could I start with you, and could you give us a little working definition, especially for people who might be joining for whom this feels very foreign and they don't really know what they're signed up for today?
Well, I think it's useful to think of, yes, patient influencers as what else they really do in the world of patient communities, which is really primarily they are patient community leaders. And a community can be as small as a private Facebook group or even an email list or a Twitter following hashtag. But these folks are now described as patient influencers because that's what the universe understands them to be, right? We're going to talk later about this, but they are not Kardashians. They are people who think of health and medicine and medical topics very seriously, do it for the intrinsic desire to help other people. But working with those folks is an opportunity for pharmaceutical and other organizations to really engage in the real-time, authentic conversations that happen in those Q&A sessions that are primarily the currency of patient influence. So for us, it's an opportunity for pharmaceuticals to open the doors, be more interactive and conversant than they've ever been before. That can help to drive business results, but also help to build trust between the industry and influencers and communities.
That's really great. Thank you. Because we know that patients listen to each other, right? The true expert of the disease is the patient who has the disease, right? And that is something very, very important. They are certainly turning to each other for conversation. Dariel, could you tell us from your perspective, what does this mean? And also a little bit about how you think it's grown in recent years.
Well, I think Jack touched on, this is where the authentic conversations between patients are happening. So patients look to other patients for advice and to ask questions and for guidance. And a lot of these diseases are very scary, and so they need a lot of help. And they're turning to each other. And so that, for pharma, is an opportunity for us to be where these conversations are happening authentically, in a very pharma safe, compliant way, right? We're not trying to sneak anything in like the Kardashian terrible example of a couple of years ago. We're trying to be, very transparent and follow all the rules and regulations that we have to do for anything that we do. It has grown very significantly over the last couple of years as I think pharma companies have become more comfortable with what is social media, what is patient leader marketing, how do we do it, how don't we do it? And so, I think it's an opportunity for us to be where the conversation is, to help raise awareness about treatment options to people who need those treatment options, and to have that, one-to-one patient conversation, because these leaders want to help their communities. And so we can provide that trusted information to them to help them do that, because that's what they want to do.
That's really great, because we want to be there where they are and help them do what they want to do. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to ask people who are watching, if you want to, so Darielle said that now a lot of our companies are more and more comfortable engaging on social media. I wonder if you feel that's true from your role yourselves, if you are in the audience. So if you'll just type into the chat really quickly, whether you feel like from your perspective, yes, this is something people are comfortable with, or no, we haven't even begun to dip our toes in, and that will help us to know what to address as we go along. So shifting over, Christina, I'd like to ask you if you would. We've heard a little bit about this from Jack and Dariel, which is a little bit more of a marketing perspective, but you're in medical affairs. Can you tell us a little bit more about your perspective of engaging with patient advocates or patient influencers for medical?
Thanks, Marjorie. I would totally echo what Jack and Dariel just said. It's true that, social media is where the conversations are happening, and we want to be part of these discussions where the dialogue is happening between patients, between also healthcare professionals and patients. And we've seen that also COVID kind of accelerated, these discussions. For example, at ASCO this year, we had 42,000 people attending, and the social media engagement during this conference was 70K higher posts on Twitter than last year. So social media, allows discussion to disseminate, also scientific data to disseminate, and sometimes even replace discussions that would happen in a Congress hall now that every meeting has shifted to virtual. So these discussions are happening organically, and for medical affairs as well, we want to be part of these discussions either through different engagements, and there is a lot of opportunities to disseminate data, to educate and raise awareness about specific diseases. So, and even more, I would say, when healthcare professionals and patients are involved in the discussions, we can even discuss about clinical trial recruitment or even diversity and inclusion in clinical trials. So a lot of discussions and many reasons to be part of these discussions.
That's so important. Thanks, Christina. And I'll mention, because I know that if you're adding something into the chat, you can't see it, but we can see it. The panelists can see it. And so you can feel free to put anything in there that you want. And I'm seeing roughly a 50-50 split between people who would say they do feel comfortable and they feel less comfortable. People are mentioning that they'd like to understand compliance guardrails, which I think is very important. We are going to talk about that. And actually, we're hearing a little bit of a difference across commercial functions versus medical functions. So it's great that we have these stakeholders on the panel. Lilly, let me come to you, please. I have a question. I mean, certainly, you bring the perspective as a patient and a patient advocate, but more and more now as a consultant and building that bridge between patients and advocacy organizations and pharma, as you've mentioned. Could you speak just quite frankly to why would a patient want to partner with pharma in this discussion? The patient already has the platform, they already have the audience. What do they need a partner in pharma for?
Yeah, sure. So patient advocates are really eager to lend their voice. They're just this font of knowledge, and what's important to remember is that they're not just representing themselves. Often patient advocates, and I use the term advocate and influencer interchangeably, because in most cases in our space, you will see that influencers are often advocates. And so these folks are regularly engaging day in and day out with what I call your everyday patient. So, your average patient who maybe doesn't think of themselves as an advocate or isn't actively working in this space. And so they're able to lend the voice of their whole community and be representative of that. And that's really powerful for these advocates. Working with pharma allows them to really pursue their purpose, pursue their mission to make healthcare more patient-centric. It also gives them the opportunity to take what they're learning within pharma and biotech in those conversations that they have in ad boards, and as they better understand the science, they can bring that back to their community and break it down and help the community understand, because ultimately they are looked to as a trusted educator and resource. And so the more knowledge that they can collect, the stronger it makes them in being that resource.
That's great. And I really appreciate that too, from the perspective that, it's my intention, and I'm sure the intention of most people on this panel and in the audience, to have the patient be at the center of our work. I mean, that is what we're all trying to do. And if patients don't want to participate with us, it's very, very hard to put them at the center. It's much easier when we have people that we can collaborate with. That's because that's our intention. So that's great.
And Marjorie, could I add one more thing that I think important clarifying point, just to level set, because I saw it come up in the comments. Somebody mentioned caregiving as well. And I think that oftentimes when we say patient influencer, we're also referring to patients and caregivers, because they're such a critical part of the ecosystem. And a lot of the times when pharmaceutical companies are working with patients, it's often caregivers, especially in conditions where, like ALS, you see a caregiver playing a really prevalent role.
That's a great point. Absolutely. Absolutely. So you brought up a couple of things, and I want to pause for a second to talk about terminology, if we could, because the title of this presentation talks about patient influencers, but I know that we've used some different terms, patient leaders, patient advocates. Could I open up to the group if you have, Jack or Dariel, a perspective on this that we haven't talked about yet? What's the right terminology, or are there multiple right terminologies?
There are definitely multiple right terminologies, and we spend a lot of time talking to our network of patient leaders. We use that as an umbrella term, and within that, folks identify as influencers, collaborators, advocates, and as Lilly said, we kind of look at those as circles which end up in a Venn diagram in some place, but folks have maybe primarily think of themselves as influencers because they like to reach a lot of people and they want to be out there really communicating with tens of thousands of people. Other folks would rather be advocates working within a small microcosm or a subset of the universe. So it is vary, but we really feel it's those three bubbles kind of overlap each other in ever changing ways. But the patient leader is the term we found kind of wraps everyone up. I would say though that it's very different to be able to describe patient influencers to the pharmaceutical marketing world and say, I get what you mean, right? At some point we're describing the function they're playing in a conversation we're having where, as Lilly said, they're coming in and helping us as peers to build a campaign to drive, to help work within pharma and bring that information back to their communities. They're working as influencers, kind of describing their role there as influencers is simply clarifying for folks in the industry.
I think that's really great. So certainly these are people who are influential, and they are patients, and they are advocates, and they are peers, and they deserve to be represented as that trusted partner with peer status is what I feel like I'm hearing.
Right, but I think I'm sorry to interrupt. I think it's fair that people sometimes associate influence with undue influence and pushing people. It's hard to say these are patient motivators or patient inspirers. It just wouldn't connect with people. But when we say patient influence, oh, I get what we're going to do together, and then transparency, authenticity, builds on the way we do it.
That's great, and we will get into.
And I think.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think also, Jack, WeGo had done some research to find that leaders is how they see themselves, right? They see themselves as leading, not just as influencing, which has a bit of a negative connotation, I think also. So I think leaders is a term that we're more comfortable with.
And if I may add to that, we briefly touched, upon this compliant framework that we want to engage with the leaders. So also from a pharmaceutical perspective, pharma company perspective, I would say that the terminology influencer is not really compliant. So from a pharma perspective, it would more be suitable to call them leaders, but of course, they are influencing as well. So
that's great. And it's a bi-directional, I think, right? They're influencing us. That's when we get into the how this is done well for a good engagement strategy. I think it's very important to know it's bi-directional because the patient advocate and educator brings the patient voice to help tell pharma what to do, right? What would be a meaningful thing to do? That is really an important part of the equation. Jack, was there any additional data that you wanted to share with us about, for people who might be joining and thinking, this sounds nice, but where does it belong on my priority list to pursue? Can you tell us a little bit about why this ought to be part of someone's strategy?
Absolutely. I think it's a very valid question because very often influencer marketing and interaction has been a little bit of a squishy public relations kind of effort. Not that there's anything wrong with PR, but that it's been unmeasurable and not really part of a marketing program. But we've done research over the years. We actually designed a study we called the Behavioral Intent Survey with a top 5 pharma company. They designed it with us, and we said, how can we be sure that this is going to be impactful for you? And we've been running the Behavioral Intent Survey for many years now across virtually all conditions. And the question that was most interesting, that was very long, is if someone who you consider influential in the community shares information from a pharmaceutical company about a specific brand of medication, how likely are you to talk to a doctor? Right? Very long question, but that's the big pharma question. And pretty consistently, the result is 87 to 90% of people say they will discuss that medication with their physician. So that's the reason for pharma to do this, is because when an influencer shares something, they know it's been vetted. They know that person, even if they're paid, is not going to share something that is not something they would like their community to hear or is appropriate for the community to hear. So what we're asking people to do is activate their communities by sharing that information.
And you can measure this just the same way as you can measure anything else you do, right? So you can measure engagement, and it is not squishy or nebulous. It is, there's data there to be measured. And what we see is that people engage with this medium and this content more so than they do with other formats that may be more, less personal, feeling like they're coming from pharma rather than from pharma with a patient leader.
Right. They're more likely to take action when they come onto a website as a click. They're not just showing up as a click. They're more likely to go check out information, watch the video, become engaged, do those kind of high value post-click actions because they're already engaged with the community.
That's fantastic. So hopefully people are feeling more informed and educated now about what we're talking about and why it would be important to do it really from, a 360-degree view. We're going to shift now into what I'm seeing coming through in a lot of the comments and questions is more of the how. So what are we really talking about? What does a campaign or a collaboration look like? What is the path to make it happen? It's a very, very big question. I'm going to start with Darielle asking a little bit about, how does a person begin to think about it? You have 20 years of experience nearly in doing this. Tell people, how do they even get started thinking about this type of strategy?
Well, I think if you have a digital innovation council or digital activation council at your company, that's the place to start with some of those experts who can identify, what do we have guidelines for or standards for, and what don't we have standards for? And then really identifying sort of a path of least resistance, which a company like WeGo can really facilitate because they've done this with number of brands over years and years, and they can provide examples and guidelines that then you can take to your leadership and say, okay, how about this, and they might say, tweak that. But really understanding what are the areas that they're uncomfortable with, and then how do you mitigate that and make them feel comfortable? I think when you say social media and especially influencer marketing on social media, it feels very like Wild West, like, patients are going to be like developing content and saying whatever they want to say. And that's not at all what this is, right? This all gets reviewed. It all gets, legal, medical, regulatory. It, abides by all of our standards for compliance and regulatory. It gets 2253'd. So when you sort of walk them through that, they feel more and more comfortable with it. But I think, there's also this tendency of, what are these shiny objects, TikTok or whatever, but you can just start where most of the conversations are happening at Facebook. That is the path that has been most paved, and that will be the easiest place to start. And then once they get more comfortable there, then you can say, okay, how is this channel different from what we've already approved, and can we expand into additional channels?
That's really great. And I think that's probably going to help a lot of people who I'm seeing in the comments are concerned about compliance guardrails, legal discomfort. So if I'm understanding you're saying it's been done on Facebook by many, many companies for quite some time now, and in other channels as well. But the easy way to begin would be to use a model that's been done so that people can react to it, see what it looks like, or to use someone who has expertise in this area like Lilly or Jack, so you don't have to start from scratch. Nobody on this call needs to figure this out for themselves. Is that a fair statement, Lilly?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll add as we think about how we actually execute on some of these campaigns, it's really critical that we're working side by side, as Jack said, with the patients and caregivers, because it adds a lot of value. And I want to give you an example of something because stories always stick with me. So I like to try to give examples when I'm speaking on these topics. This example actually comes from, it's not pharma, but it is a healthcare product. It's an over-the-counter product that they've developed, a mouthwash for people who get mouth sores from chemo and radiation. And so I actually worked with Savvy Co-op, and it looks like there's a few folks on the call from Savvy to recruit some cancer patient influencers. And then I went ahead and conducted a focus group with these cancer influencers to get their feedback, to hear what their experience was like. And they're just in a 2-hour conversation, the results were unbelievable to hear that, this was impacting them so many different facets of their life, these mouth sores. And when they brought it up with their HCPs, it was dismissed because the doctor said, listen, we've got bigger fish to fry. We're trying to get rid of your cancer. So what we did was we actually came up with the hashtag campaign, hashtag more than a sore, to communicate how these sores were really impacting the patient's life. And we were on TikTok and blogs and Instagram and all of these different places where patients actually told their story about how one woman talked about how it impacted her ability to do Taco Tuesday with her family. Another talked about how she, couldn't sleep and how they couldn't talk. And so it was really just deeply impacting their quality of life. And we would have never come up with that campaign concept had it not been for running that focus group to get the insights. And so I think that working collaboratively to identify messaging that's going to resonate is really critical, and is going to be to the benefit of both the patient and the company.
That's great. And I can see how that really made a big difference in quality of life in a way that wasn't being addressed through sort of the traditional medical channels. And so that's really the value add that I'm hearing that this brings. One comment that I'm seeing come through is the perception that this conversation is very US focused, and the rest of the world, pharma is not allowed to have an impact on choice of medicine from the patient perspective. I wonder if there's anyone on this panel who would like to comment on this. Clearly, I think, these types of campaigns are designed to be educational in nature and not to have a direct impact on prescribing. But is there anyone who'd like to come off mute and comment more on this to make it more helpful for people who might be joining us from outside the US?
I think yes, as you said, Marjorie, the opportunity in non-DTC markets right outside of US and New Zealand is disease awareness and education, which can be very, very impactful as well, right? The opportunity to build a connection to patient education around the disease and around living with the disease can create that slightly indirect connection, but a very unbranded connection. This is something we've certainly done a fair amount of that. Health Union and We Go Health have always been US focused for obvious reasons. It's where it's much easier to do our work there, but non-branded programs, unbranded programs work very well ex-US.
Great, thank you. And Lilly, I want to ask you a question because I'm seeing another comment that seems like it might be relevant for you about incorporating the patient voice into content that's intended for a physician audience. So rather than a patient to patient influence, what about patient to healthcare professional influence? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's so interesting because you see a lot of pharmaceutical companies who are used to the traditional HCP advisory boards. So that's something that they're very comfortable with. And I think we've started to see patient advisory boards coming through. But once a pharma company finally does an advisory board with a patient advocate, they can't believe the difference in what they're hearing from the HCPs versus what they're hearing from the patients. And so there is a lot of value in threading the patient insight through the marketing that you're bringing to HCPs. And so what I would recommend in that case is that you actually, you do some of the focus groups or the ad boards to pull out some of those quotes and direct from patient. And I think that that's how you approach it. You literally take the words that are coming from the patients, these direct quotes, and you integrate them into the HCP marketing. And I think when there's an opportunity, it doesn't always work out this way, depending upon the indication and what the landscape looks like, but the ability to actually bring HCPs and patients together and work collaboratively to all of you co-create some of that material can be really valuable, because the patients can give their perspective and then the HCPs can say, hey, okay, this is good. I think this is going to resonate, or, ooh, this is going to be off-putting. We have to frame it a little bit differently. And so I think that could be an effective way to get that message out.
Fantastic. Christina or Dariel, anything to add?
Yes, I would like to. Can you still hear me? Okay. So I would definitely agree with what Lily just shared. And there are examples where HCPs are brought in the same table with patients, and the discussions are very fruitful. Facebook groups can also be leveraged on, educating patients and creating content together with HCPs. And another type of engagement that could be used on social media is the so-called tutorials, which is a video that tells a small story that can have either an educational or informational type, and we can invite both patients as well as healthcare professionals in this discussion to make sure that both perspectives are addressing the topic discussed. So a lot of different engagements can happen, and it's definitely very, very crucial to make sure that the patient is a trusted partner in this engagement, and that we look for long-term partnerships with patients, not one-off type of engagements. So I would say, on the how-to that we discussed, a very, very important thing to remember is that when we partner with patients, we approach them as trusted partners and equal partners.
That's so important. And I think I even recognize some names of people who are on this chat today who I think will really appreciate that because patients are trusted partners. They are the ones who are most informed about their experience and the disease that they have. And I think the motto is nothing about us without us, right? From the patient point of view, really, really important to have everybody at the table. Darielle, you have something to add.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, a real patient story, their authentic story, just makes it so much richer, and it makes it so real and emotional, right? So from the marketing perspective, we may have our strategy and, we do research and, we believe we have all these insights into patients, but really hearing it in their voice, in their words, from their mouth, there's nothing like it. And it just makes that connection so much more real. And that's why we do what we do. And so I think if you can share that with your HCP community, that makes it even more rich.
Fantastic.
I would just build on that this has really evolved in a good way. And I give people on this panel credit for this, Lilly and Savvy and Dariel at DSK, folks at Novartis, all of whom we've worked with that have said, look, it used to be, patients were understood through quant research and surveys. That was good enough. Then there was focus groups. We were behind the mirror with the M&Ms, and they were out there, and that was kind of what I called the patient petting zoo, where we were just saying, okay, that's now we get it. But now we're saying not just patient-centric, patients in the middle of us looking at them, but patients at the table with us, and that's what's really changed. Is patients like Lilly, who is more a consultant and an expert now than she is a patient, but she brings that credential of being a patient to the table, and people say that's fantastic. You have accountability to a project with us. You're working side by side with us. You're not just a test subject, and that's really changed for the better. And that's what health union communities are built with. Over 20 advocates work on each community as real-time content contributors. They write about what they want to write about, not what we tell them for SEO. Health influencers are, of course, creating their own communities organically. So working with those folks to say, what can you tell me that will contribute to things at the table as peers with us?
That's so important. And Jack, if I could stick on you for a moment, there is something coming up that I feel like we talked about in our pre-call. One of the questions is coming in about rare disease and the potential investment on the part of the company for looking into this kind of collaboration for such a small audience. So what about rare diseases, maybe populations of just a few hundred? You've done work in that space, haven't you?
Yes, rare disease is, as we all know, the fastest growing, maybe one of the most exciting parts of the pharmaceutical industry. What had been a misconception was that we need to find influencers who reach 27,000 people, or we can't speak to them, they're not worthwhile. But in rare disease, it may be someone who has a following of 24 people or 36 people. And it may be that we're working with folks who are ambassadors and early stage to grow their ability to communicate and become community leaders, right? So they're never going to be influencers in anything like the Ashton Kutcher kind of the part of the word, or even nano influencers as we call them. But for them to reach 20, 30, 50 people is important, and for us to teach them and help them. So very often we'll work with, for example, ambassador programs where someone is speaking about the disease and their personal story, but they're also comfortable with social media, and we help them to become effectively an influencer even within a very small group of folks. I think that's a growth area for companies who are looking to say, how can we educate folks? The other thing that's important to remember about rare disease, and this is a massive oversimplification, but in many, many, many cases, rare diseases are misdiagnosed as something far more common. I think of porphyria, which is a disease that Alnylam works with in a very rare community. It's about 5% of the folks who are usually in IBS or IBSD kind of communities thinking they have a very chronic case and untreatable case of that. Turns out they have this genetic disease that they don't know about. So for us to work with influencers in those communities to say, hey, look, I'm not trying to sell you anything, but I've been talking to you for 6 months about your inability to have treatment stick. Let's try to, why don't you try and get a genetic test? Maybe this is something that can help you. And for folks like that, it's a cure for that disease that they have as genetically. But it's very hard for pharma to say I could invest in a big campaign across all of IBS and IBSD, but influencers and patient leaders can say, let's talk about people who really have intractable disease. Maybe they should look at another solution. Your cat agrees with me, by the way.
I like to be on camera.
Fantastic.
One of the questions that I'm seeing come up, which I think I'd like to, address these sort of as they come, because I think it's very, very relevant, is what about the idea of bridging that gap for demographics, basically, that if you have patients who are not particularly active online, is shifting focus to these kinds of collaborations going to exacerbate healthcare disparities? I realize that's a little bit probably separate from what we intended to talk about today, but it's so important. Lily, what do you want to say about that?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a really great question and a critical question. And I think that there's a level of, there are some influencers out there who are really working to champion diversity, equity, and inclusion in our space in healthcare. And so it is identifying those advocates and those influencers and working with them, and you start there. And I think that, while we can't get into this because this is kind of your whole patient advocacy and engagement approach instead of just influencers. But I also think that it's important that we're collecting insights from diverse populations and maybe people who aren't even online, right? And that involves some of that grassroots work of going to YMCAs and faith-based communities and building relationships with those boots on the ground influencers, if you will. So, and those again are the pastors and the YMCA leaders and the community clinic leaders. And so that needs to be a part of your strategy alongside the influencer strategy. But if we're talking strictly influencers, there are folks out there who focus on DE&I and partner and advocacy, and partnering with them is just the way to go.
Yeah, we've actually had experience with reaching into the African American community in lupus, for example, where in-person events were very, very popular, but weren't reaching enough people. And using influencers online, we were able to educate them, this is happening in your area. They would then go offline or communicate people through more traditional means, even email or more direct outreach. And we're able to get a lot more folks to participate in those offline activities. So I think, again, folks are willing to jump across out of the digital world to help folks find things that they need to.
That's great, thank you. There are a couple of questions coming through that are more on the medical affairs perspective. And I think this is really interesting. What does the interaction look like from the medical affairs perspective? We touched on that briefly already, Christina and Lily. I'll come to you as well, because some of these questions are also reiterating what I think we spoke to, but it's maybe worth re-emphasizing so that this panel isn't all about, what's in it for pharma, but what's in it for the patient? Why would a patient who already has a platform and already has a connected audience or community, what is the benefit to them of connecting with pharma in this type of collaborative work? Right, because this is not just about, it's not just about marketing, right? This is about making sure that people have education that they need and information that they need. So Lily, I welcome your thoughts on that. And then Christina, perhaps if you wish. I mean, I know we've already touched on some of this, but I think it's of interest. We may want to say it again.
Yeah, sure. So to reiterate, I think there's all of these advocates and influencers. Again, I'm using that term interchangeably. They do really care about having their voice heard, and they're spending their days interfacing with everyday patients who are and everyday patients, again, those are folks who maybe don't identify as an advocate. They're not super active in their healthcare, but they are reaching out to these advocates and influencers for feedback. And so what advocates and influencers are able to do is, if you're having conversations with them, they can, bring back the insights that they're hearing, and they can help you design, if we're looking on the med affairs side, right, which is I think where the question was coming, they can help with designing clinical trial protocols and giving insight into how you design the marketing around your clinical trial, or and all of the medical language that surrounds. I know like gene therapy is big now in the rare community, and so thinking about this as a completely new type of treatment, it's not just talking about the clinical trial, but it's actually education around the therapy. And so there's work where patients can come in and they can give you feedback and they can help you design what that looks like. And so I think on the med affairs side, it's maybe less about the influencing publicly, and it's about the influencing internally, influencing that that language that is then going to go out. Oh, Marjorie,
anything you'd like to add, Christina?
Definitely. So on the point that you raised before, I think it's there is a lot of needs and benefits to engage with the patients from a medical affairs perspective. First of all, to amplify and highlight the needs and the concerns of the patient advocates. I would say that it's very beneficial. Lily, I think you mentioned before having patient advisory boards. I would also add having patient and HCP advisory board. So having, again, those two stakeholders on the table. And even better, having policymakers on the table as well. So just to through social media to engage with them and understand better their needs, and also raise awareness, educating. For example, we can have biomarker testing campaigns, and for many, for example, for lung cancer, there is a gap when patients are diagnosed. They don't really do the biomarker testing needed for lung cancer. So how can we, address this gap through social media and raise the awareness for biomarker testing? And very good point, Lily, you raised designing clinical trial protocols with the patients. That's really key for medical affairs. I wouldn't say that this has happened through social media yet, not from what I know of, but definitely reaching out to the patients, and potentially through social media could be another channel, to have even a bigger quantitative input from patients on clinical trial protocols. And then the other piece I would say is, the compliance framework, really understanding what are the guide rails and what can happen from a medical affairs perspective, and where we cannot touch on. So for example, we can use the fair market value rates to make sure that when engaging with the patients, their reimbursement is standardized. Also understanding the terminology, like we said before. And I would say these are key items. And in terms of addressing and making sure that there is diversity and inclusion when engaging with patients, I would say that it's really key to map out the channels and understand which channel, provides opportunities and limitations. So for example, we know that TikTok or Snapchat, we can reach more young audiences there. Or that LinkedIn is not maybe the best channel to engage with patients because of the targeting specific conditions and the limitations from a LinkedIn perspective. So understanding the channels or even across different geographies. For example, China, we know that they are using WeChat. In Latin America, Instagram is very common to use. So again, in every geography, I would say it's different needs and opportunities. So understanding the needs and the opportunities in each area could enhance and make sure that we address the audience in a proper way.
Thanks, Christina. And Lily and Jack, I'm going to ask a question to the both of you, because it's come in from a couple different people in a variety of fashions, and I'm going to just choose one as the representative nature. But it's getting to the difference between organizations respecting patient advocates as peers and as leaders versus, what has been described as a marketing prop, right? So not feeling like you're being used as a tool in marketing, but indeed as a partner and a peer. Could you address this? I know we've touched on it briefly, but what is your experience there? What would you say about that?
It's a question we get all the time from folks about how do we maintain objectivity? How does someone maintain their authenticity as the leader of a community versus being perceived as working for the pharma company? And that's changed a lot as well. What folks are looking for more information from pharma in communities. And I think pharma has been weary of participating directly in patient communities, having conversations directly. So patient leaders and community leaders are the ones who can be that liaison. And increasingly, folks are saying it's great that folks like Lilly and WeGo and Health Union are connecting pharma to these folks directly, because folks have kind of walked up to the big ivory tower and said, I don't know even where the door is, let alone how to get up the stairs and into the room. So making that connection is something folks have been hungry for. So that's evolved from versus to what's work with in a very, very positive way. But I think the idea that we need to co-create together is so important. This is not a process of here's the marketing message, we'll pay you to distribute it. It's what's the message that's important for your community. We talked about diversity and inclusion earlier. One of the things we've done is found out that, for example, in the African American community, there was a preference for receiving something in the physical mail versus getting only an online download of something. So that kind of collaboration allowed the campaign to evolve and be far more successful. And a communication that comes from the influencer about that conversation, like, we're going to send this to you because I know you're going to, and then talking about the kit that they're excited about having co-created, that's going to have multiples of engagement and response from a marketing perspective because it's authentic and because the outcome was driven by that combination.
Yeah, I'll just echo, Jack, I think you hit the nail on the head. And, it is just about you. It is so obvious when something isn't co-created. And so the ability to weave in the patient experience and the story. And again, if I use that example that I brought up earlier with the More Than a Store campaign, those patients were able to integrate their own stories, right? So we had a common theme, we had something we all agreed on, but they could share their experiences. If we had just given them copy to share, it wouldn't have resonated. So, not only is it's that would be using patients as a prop, and it wouldn't add any value to either side, because it needs to be authentic for people to actually believe you and want to have trust in you.
I think maybe a very tactical tip, which seems obvious when you say it, but if you are creating a video with an influencer that's about a medication, to say, what would you like to say? But here's the question, but what's your answer going to be? Let them answer it, and in their own words, create some bullet points of that answer, bring those to regulatory and say, is this okay if they say these things from a regulatory perspective? And then you can go back to the influencer and say, we can't really say it's a cure because it's not. Helping them to understand the regulatory process, but maintaining that, this is discussion bullets, not a script, not something that we're telling you to do. And that back and forth isn't as hard as it sounds. It allows for interaction of regulatory but just starting with what that authentic voice is to begin the conversation.
That's so important, Jack. And I want to make sure that we have time to talk about this a little bit as we're talking about, how to execute these kind of collaborations and campaigns for co-creation. One of the things that is so important is that because pharma is a highly regulated environment, it's that amount of sort of red tape often feels quite foreign and perhaps intimidating to patients. And so helping them to understand that if you ask for, what would you like to say, and they provide what they would like to say, that will go to regulatory and have to be lined up to the evidence behind the asset to see if it can be said. Dariel, would you like to add some perspective on that for us?
Yeah, I think one of the questions you asked a couple of minutes ago was like, why do leaders want to partner with pharma? And I think that's actually part of the reason why is they want to share their stories about your brand. Very often, they want to evangelize a brand that has made a difference in their life. They want to tell others, but they don't have all of the right information, right? Like as Jack said, they might say this is a cure or something that is not actually accurate. And so we can provide that, that correct information for them. So, very often they are looking to us to be that expert about the brand, and they can be the voice for them, the voice for that. And I think exactly, what was just said is the right way to do it. Let's hear your story. How would you answer this question? What would you want to tell your community? What do you think they're interested in? What kind of questions are you hearing? What kind of information do you want to share? And then you take that back and you craft it and you get review, and then you come back and say, okay, we're going to steer clear of this. We're going to focus on this. And then you can also, do some, use your words. Okay, now let's use the safe words, and maybe one of the takes in the middle is perfectly acceptable, even though that's not something that you originally brought to legal. So, it is a bit of an art, as well as a formalized process.
Yeah, and so much of that is intended, of course, to be sure that there isn't an overstatement of efficacy or a minimization of safety. Lilly, when we were talking in the prep call, you were mentioning how that it may be helpful when you begin to engage with patients to help them to understand a little bit about what the processes look like inside pharma, just what to expect. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So, there are some advocates and influencers out there now who this is old hat for them. They know how it works because they've done this a number of times with different companies. But as we continue to see more and more advocates and influencers coming on the scene, this can be new for them when they're working with a company, and it can look different from company to company. So managing expectations of what this is going to look like, and knowing that pharma moves kind of slow, right? Unfortunately, you're going to do an ad board or you're going to have a conversation about the campaign, and it could take a few months before that actually comes to fruition. It could even be a few years. That's just the timeline. And so managing those expectations, being transparent, explaining to advocates when you can, hey, we can't include this. Here's the reason. This language goes against our legal and compliance. They'll understand. And so I think it's important to do that, and also important to think about, we didn't mention this, we haven't mentioned this throughout, but I do think it's also important, and I know that all the folks on this call do this, is to compensate patients for their time, and advocates, and making sure that you are compensating at fair market value for their time. That is absolutely essential. They are bringing a high value to the organization. And so along those lines, compensating them, and then outlining those expectations of when you get compensation, because again, those cycles can be long. So just again, managing those expectations up front, being transparent, and things will run smoothly.
Absolutely. That's really great. Jack, I see you coming off mute.
I'm just laughing because yes, the most frequent question we get from influencers is, what's taking so damn long? What's going on here? And yes, that education about the process, they want to learn it, and they're actually fascinated by the label, and this is the indication that we have to stick to when we talk about it. So it helps them to be translators to their community by learning that process too. So yeah, but it does take a long time, and it's only because there's steps that we go through that are additional, but it's not particularly painful from a regulatory perspective. It just, there's probably a couple of extra steps to include that authentic voice, that those early stages of co-creation mean, there's 3 approvals versus just 1 for a commercial.
Yeah.
And if I can add.
Oh, yes, Christina.
If I can add to that, from the pharma perspective, of course, we understand, the processes, and sometimes that it takes so long, and we need to explain why it takes so long. But also from the pharma perspective, I think it's very, very nice in the end to thank the patients or the patient advocates, and make sure that we share the results of whatever the engagement is, either it's an advisory board or any kind of engagement. We share the result, and we follow up, making sure that this reflects their actual thoughts and insights towards the end, to make sure that they're part of that ending process as well. And maybe also follow up after 6 months to make sure, or check whether there is anything else to add, or any other thoughts around it. So very important to close the engagement with a proper way.
Absolutely. And you know, of course, compensation is important, but the meaning behind what they've really brought to the table and what they're bringing back to their communities, so important to honor. We have just a minute or two left, but Lily, I saw you had one more thing to say on
Yeah,
that.
and this is super quick. I just wanted to point out that Haley in the chat posted the National Health Council's Fair Market Value Calculator, and that's a great gold standard if you are struggling internally to figure out what the cost should look like, or if you need to justify it to legal and compliance who's giving you some pushback. That can be a great standard to use. And I also know the folks at Health Union and WeGo have a lot of experience in this and can help guide you there too.
Yeah, fantastic. That's really, really important. So
one more, if I could just one more benefit to patient leaders to working with pharma. You know, one of my favorite stories is actually at GSK, a patient leader brought in to see the presentation of the campaign internally, taking a picture of the slide that showed how many people that campaign reached. In this campaign, you know, normally her reach would be 10,000 people or so, which is a big influencer, right? But she had reached, you know, 3 to 4 million people through this campaign. And that's the ultimate collaboration is my authentic voice is now reaching millions of people because pharmaceutical has supported and got behind me with the dollars that I know they have. And that's the right combination. That she was literally tearing up and crying about, like, I can't believe I reached so many people. This is so exciting for me to have been, you know, amplified this way. And I think that's the ultimate benefit of working together.
that's fantastic. Making a big difference, right? It's a sort of a macro difference. So if you have a question, get it in because we're just about out of time. But I want to ask the group just one more time when we think about the future. So we've talked a lot about where we've come and what we're doing now. But when we think about the future and how this type of work will continue to evolve and grow, can you give me just one or two sentences about your predictions? And I'm going to start with you, Jack. What is your prediction of what's coming down the horizon?
Well, I think a fast way to say it is, you know, Facebook is in every way the NBC of 15 years ago, right? And it's the big everywhere, everyone's there. It's kind of the cool fire of social media, but cable is coming. You know, streaming is coming. The fragmentation of social into thousands and thousands of points of light in a constellation that people are ricocheting among is happening. That complexity is getting greater and greater. So for me, the focus is going to continue to be on the people who are having the conversation. So talking to Lilly about what, you know, people in her community are doing, talking to folks who are leaders of those communities that can kind of unite the conversation, less about should I do Clubhouse or TikTok, and more about should I talk to, you know, to Alicia or Rochelle, and those people are going to help you to bring it together and make sense of it through their voice versus the channels being the leader.
All about the people. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Darielle, parting thoughts for you on the future.
Yeah, just to build on that. So with that fragmentation comes a lot of challenges from an executional standpoint. And so what our challenge or opportunity is to develop content that can be easily used across multiple channels, and not, you know, if there's going to be 20 channels, you don't want to have to make 20 different versions of things. So how can we be more flexible and use more flexible content to work in multiple channels?
Really important. And I'm coming to you, Christina and Lily, but I'd also like to welcome Reuters to put a parting slide up so that if you want to continue, if you've enjoyed this and you want to continue your learning with Reuters, we'll share a slide as we go. But before we're done, thinking about the future, Christina, what is coming down the pike for you?
I'm sure that these type of engagements through social media are going to amplify, and we will find even more ways to engage with patient leaders through social media. What I really aspire and I'm hoping for the future is to have these discussions with as many stakeholders as possible on the table. So, you know, bringing perspectives from patient leaders, from medical experts, from external experts like policymakers, to make sure that every voice is heard and we co-create together. So the content that Dariel mentioned is co-created and, you know, addresses the real needs of the patients, because as always, what we do it for the patients, and we need to make sure that we address the real their needs. So that's what I see for the future.
Absolutely. And finally, Lily, the last word is for you. What is the future in this space as you see it?
I'll keep it short and sweet. If you don't get on board working with patient advocates and influencers, you're going to get left behind.
Well said, powerfully said. So I know there are some questions that we haven't been able to answer. I'll just go ahead and offer to speak for Jack and Lily in that if they can be answered, maybe you'll get some follow-up in that regard, since they're professionals in this area and they may be able to follow up with you in that regard. You may be able to reach out to them directly for expertise that you still have questions about lingering. And with that, I will conclude our session. Thank you so much to the hundreds of people who attended and gave us a really, really great engagement, lots of food for thought. And thank you to my panelists. What a fantastic amount of expertise you've given us. Thank you.
Great job, Marjorie. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye all.